People often think revenge begins with yelling, slammed doors, or dramatic confrontations. They imagine justice arriving with fireworks and public humiliation. My experience taught me something entirely different. The strongest kind of revenge doesn't start with anger. It begins with dignity. It waits patiently while the truth finds its own way to the surface. My name is Michael Bunnett, and at 55 years old, I've lived a life most people would call ordinary. For the last 28 years, I've worked as an operations supervisor for a distribution company just outside Columbus, Ohio. My routine rarely changes. Every weekday, I leave home before sunrise, grab a cup of black coffee that usually goes cold before lunchtime, and drive my 12-year-old silver pickup to work. The truck isn't much to look at anymore. The paint has faded from years in the sun, one speaker only works when it feels like it, and the driver's seat has been stitched together twice. Friends have told me for years that I should buy something newer. I always give them the same answer. If it still gets me where I need to go, why replace it? That answer usually earns a laugh. I've never cared much about appearances. The same goes for my lunches. Almost every day, I carry a homemade turkey sandwich, an apple, and a bottle of water. My cuckas joke that I'm the easiest man in America to predict. One afternoon, my friend Steve shook his head while looking into my lunchbox. "Mike, you've eaten the same meal for at least 10 years. I smiled. "And yet I'm still alive." He laughed. "You really don't like change, do you?" "I like things that work." That was my philosophy. Simple, reliable, quiet. Looking back now, I realize my daughter saw those same qualities very differently. To her, they eventually became signs that I'd never accomplished much. She didn't know that behind every ordinary choice was a sacrifice I'd made for her future. She also didn't know that months later, I would hand her a cashier's check for $50,000 so she could have the wedding she'd always imagined. She hugged me with tears in her eyes. She thanked me over and over. Then, on the biggest day of her life, she stood before 200 guests and turned me into the punchline of her speech. At that moment, I thought the greatest pain wasn't what she'd said. I was wrong. The hardest part was realizing she truly believed every word. And she had no idea that before the night ended, someone in that ballroom would reveal a truth that would change everything. My daughter, Emily, got engaged on a crisp autumn evening. The young man she chose, Ethan Carter, impressed me from the very beginning. He wasn't the loudest person in the room, nor the kind who tried to impress people with expensive watches or polished speeches. Instead, he listened carefully, treated everyone with respect, and made Emily laugh in a way I hadn't seen in years. The night he proposed, our family gathered for dinner. Emily couldn't stop smiling. Ethan looked nervous enough to spill his drink. My wife, Susan, leaned toward me and whispered with a grin, "Please don't tease him tonight." I smiled innocently. I've never embarrassed anyone. She gave me the same look she'd perfected during 24 years of marriage. "That's the biggest lie you've told all year." Everyone laughed. A few minutes later, Ethan stood, reached into his jacket pocket and asked Emily to marry him. She burst into happy tears before he even finished speaking. As the room filled with applause, I looked at my daughter and realized something that every parent eventually understands. No matter how old they become, part of you will always see the child they used to be. Later that evening, after the excitement settled, Emily quietly found me alone in the kitchen. "Dad," she said softly, "can I ask you something?" The expression on her face reminded me of the little girl who used to ask for one more bedtime story. I smiled. "Of course." She pulled out her phone and showed me pictures of a breathtaking wedding venue. "I've dreamed about getting married here for years." Then she hesitated, before adding the part she was nervous to say. But it's expensive. I looked at the photographs one more time, before asking the only question that mattered. How expensive? She took a slow breath. About $46,000. Without saying another word. I already knew exactly what my answer would be. Emily sat across from me at the kitchen table, nervously twisting her phone between her hands. I know it's a ridiculous amount of money, she said, avoiding eye contact. You don't have to say yes, I just wanted you to see it. I looked at the pictures again. The estate was stunning, rolling green lawns, a white stone chapel overlooking a small lake, and a reception hall glowing beneath crystal chandeliers. It looked like something pulled from a magazine. I handed her phone back with a smile. When do you need the deposit? She stared at me. Wait, you're serious? I asked when. Her eyes widened. Dad, I can't let you spend that much. I chuckled. 5 seconds ago, you were trying to convince me it was your dream venue. She laughed through happy tears. It is. Then that's all I need to know. Without warning, she wrapped her arms around me. Thank you. I hugged her tightly. You only get married once, I said with a grin. Let's make sure it's a day you never forget. At least that's what I hoped. What Emily didn't know was that I had been preparing for that day for nearly 15 years. When she was 13, Susan and I quietly opened a savings account with one purpose. Emily's wedding. Every month, no matter how tight our budget became, I transferred something into that account. Sometimes it was only $100. Sometimes, after working overtime during the holidays, it was much more. There were years when unexpected expenses tempted us to dip into those savings. When our roof started leaking, we repaired it instead of replacing it. When my truck needed major engine work, I rebuilt the engine with the help of a friend instead of buying another vehicle. Susan once suggested taking a vacation to Hawaii after our 20th anniversary. Before I could answer, she smiled. Forget I asked. She already knew. The wedding fund, she said. I nodded. She squeezed my hand. It'll be worth it. Looking back now, she was right. Just not for the reasons either of us expected. The following Friday, Emily met me at the local bank. She thought I was helping with the deposit. Instead, I asked the teller for a certified check. When the amount appeared on the paper, Emily's mouth fell open. $50,000. Dad, she whispered. You didn't have to cover everything. I know. This is too much. No, I replied gently. It's exactly enough. She looked at me with tears filling her eyes. I don't know how I'll ever repay you. I smiled. You already have. She frowned. What do you mean? Watching you grow into the woman you are. She hugged me again, holding on a little longer this time. I'll never forget this. Those words stayed with me. Funny thing about promises. People usually mean them when they make them. Life simply has a way of testing whether they remember them later. As the months passed, wedding planning consumed nearly every conversation. Emily called almost every evening to ask my opinion. What do you think about ivory tablecloths instead of white? Do roses look better than peonies? Should the band play classic songs or modern ones? I laughed. I think you're asking the wrong person. Why? My decorating experience ends with hanging Christmas lights. She giggled. I still want your opinion. I answered every question. Not because I cared about flower arrangements. Because she did. And that made them important to me. One evening after Emily left our house, Susan sat beside me on the back porch. Can I ask you something? Always. Have you noticed she's changed a little? I frowned. What do you mean? Susan hesitated. She talks about success differently now. I didn't understand. She's spending more time with people who care about appearances. Bigger homes. Luxury cars. Designer clothes. I shrugged. She's young. Maybe. Susan looked out across our backyard. But sometimes, I worry she's beginning to mistake wealth for character. I shook my head. Emily knows better than that. Susan didn't argue. She simply gave me a small, uncertain smile. At the time, I believed she was worrying over nothing. I wanted to believe my daughter still saw the world the same way I had taught her to. I had no idea that, months later, standing beneath crystal chandeliers surrounded by family and friends, I would discover just how much she had changed. The months passed faster than any of us expected. One tasting became 3. Invitations were mailed, tuxedos were fitted, flowers were chosen, and every tiny detail Emily had dreamed about slowly became reality. Our weekends disappeared into planning meetings, vendor appointments, and last-minute decisions that somehow always seemed urgent. Through it all, I never complained. Every time I saw Emily's excitement, I reminded myself why Susan and I had spent so many years making sacrifices. This was her moment. And if I had to drive my old pickup for another decade to make it happen, I would have done it without hesitation. The wedding day finally arrived on a warm Saturday in early May. The estate looked even more breathtaking than the photographs Emily had shown me months earlier. The gardens were filled with blooming white roses and lavender. Small fountains sparkled beneath the afternoon sun, while soft violin music drifted through the air as guests began taking their seats. I stood near the entrance, adjusting my tie. Susan walked over and smiled. Let me guess. What? You tied it too short again. I thought it looked fine. She laughed. It looks like you're interviewing for your first job. I've been wearing ties for 30 years. And somehow, she teased while fixing it, you still need supervision. I grinned. That's why I married you. She rolled her eyes, but I caught her smiling. Those little moments always reminded me that happiness wasn't built on expensive things. It was built on people. Guests continued arriving throughout the afternoon. Many of them were Ethan's coworkers from a respected financial consulting firm. Most wore tailored suits, luxury watches, and shoes that probably cost more than my monthly grocery bill. Not once did I feel out of place. I had spent my life learning that confidence isn't something you buy. It's something you earn. Several guests introduced themselves politely. One elderly couple thanked me for hosting such a beautiful celebration. A younger man complimented the venue. You must be proud. I am, I answered honestly. They smiled, never realizing I'd quietly paid for almost everything surrounding them. I didn't feel the need to tell them. Real generosity doesn't come with a receipt. Then the music changed. Everyone stood. The large wooden doors opened, and Emily appeared. For a moment, every conversation stopped. She looked radiant. Her elegant white gown shimmered in the afternoon light, and her smile carried the excitement every father hopes to see on his daughter's wedding day. She slipped her arm through mine. You okay? She whispered. I smiled. I was about to ask you the same thing. She laughed softly. I'm terrified. That's normal. What if I trip? I'll pretend I didn't see it. She nudged my arm. You're impossible. I've been told. The walk down the aisle felt both endless and impossibly short. With every step, memories rushed through my mind. Teaching her to ride a bicycle. helping with science projects at the kitchen table, waiting backstage before her first school play because she was too nervous to go on alone. Now I was placing her hand into someone else's. It's a strange feeling. Part pride, part heartbreak, part gratitude. When Ethan looked at her, his eyes filled with tears. That was all I needed to know. He truly loved her. The ceremony was beautiful. Simple vows, heartfelt promises, smiles that felt genuine. When the officiant announced them husband and wife, applause echoed across the gardens. Susan quietly slipped her hand into mine. We did it. I nodded. Yeah, we did. For a few minutes, I believed the hardest part of the day was behind us. I couldn't have been more wrong. As evening settled over the estate, everyone moved into the grand reception hall. Crystal chandeliers cast a warm glow across polished wooden floors, while candles flickered on every table. A live jazz band played softly as guests admired the elegant decorations Emily had spent months choosing. The seating chart directed Susan and me to table 8, tucked near the side of the ballroom. I laughed quietly. Susan looked at me. What now? I just realized something. What? I paid for the ballroom. She sighed, already knowing where I was going. Michael, I paid for the food. I know. I even paid for the band. She smiled despite herself. And somehow, I glanced toward the head table. The father of the bride is sitting far enough away to need binoculars. Susan laughed and shook her head. You'll never change. No, I don't think I will. Neither of us knew that before the night was over, every person in that ballroom would be looking directly at our table. The reception settled into a warm, cheerful rhythm. The band switched from soft jazz to light acoustic music while waiters moved gracefully between tables, refilling glasses and serving dinner. Laughter echoed through the ballroom as relatives who hadn't seen each other in years caught up over stories from the past. Susan leaned toward me after taking another bite of her meal. I have to admit, she whispered. What? You were right. I smiled. About what? The food. I told you all those tasting appointments would pay off. She laughed quietly. And I complained through every single one. You certainly did. Across the room, Emily and Ethan were making their way from table to table, thanking every guest personally. They looked genuinely happy, stopping to hug relatives, pose for photographs, and share a few laughs with friends. Watching them together filled me with pride. No matter what happened from this point forward, I told myself, they had started their marriage surrounded by people who cared about them. That thought made every sacrifice feel worthwhile. Eventually, the wedding coordinator stepped onto the dance floor and tapped her microphone. If everyone could please take their seats, she announced with a smile, it's time for a few toasts. The room quickly quieted. Ethan's best man spoke first. His speech was exactly what you'd expect. Funny stories from college, a few harmless jokes about Ethan's terrible cooking, and a heartfelt reminder that true friendship is measured by loyalty, not time. The guests laughed often and applauded loudly when he finished. Next came Emily's maid of honor, Rachel. Unlike the best man, Rachel didn't try to entertain the room. She simply spoke from the heart. She talked about meeting Emily during their first week of college, surviving difficult exams together, celebrating promotions, comforting each other after heartbreak, and watching Emily become more confident over the years. By the end of her speech, several guests were quietly wiping away tears. Susan smiled. That was beautiful. It really was. For a moment, everything felt exactly as it should. Then Emily stood. She accepted the microphone with a confident smile and looked around the ballroom. I just want to thank every one of you for being here tonight. Warm applause filled the room. She waited for it to settle before continuing. This day has been a dream of mine for a very long time. More smiles. I've been incredibly lucky to have people in my life who always encouraged me to dream bigger. She turned toward Susan. My mom taught me that hard work and ambition can open doors you never thought possible. Susan smiled proudly. I applauded too. Then Emily looked toward my table. And then there was my dad. I smiled, expecting a few sentimental stories. Maybe she'd mention the camping trips we'd taken every summer, or the afternoons we spent building birdhouses in the garage. Instead, she laughed softly. My dad is probably the most predictable man you'll ever meet. The guests chuckled. He still drives the same pickup truck he bought over a decade ago. A few people laughed. I smiled politely. That was true enough. He refuses to replace anything unless it's completely worn out. More laughter followed. My friends used to joke that if Dad ever won the lottery, he'd still shop with coupons. The room laughed louder. I laughed too. At least. At first. Emily continued smiling. He packs the exact same turkey sandwich for lunch almost every single day. Someone at a nearby table jokingly held up a dinner roll like a sandwich, and more laughter spread across the ballroom. He still thinks family game night is a perfect vacation. Another wave of chuckles. He even wears clip-on ties because, according to him, they're faster. Without thinking, I touched my tie. More guests laughed. Susan's smile slowly disappeared. She reached under the table and gently took my hand. Her fingers tightened. Something inside me shifted. The jokes suddenly didn't feel affectionate anymore. They felt different. Emily wasn't laughing with me. She was inviting everyone else to laugh at me. She looked toward Ethan and smiled. My dad has always been happy living a very simple life. She paused. And honestly, I spent years wondering why he never wanted more. The laughter stopped. Several guests exchanged uncertain glances. Emily continued, unaware of the change in the room. But Ethan showed me that sometimes you have to leave your comfort zone behind if you want to build the life you've always dreamed about. A few people offered polite applause. I remained perfectly still. She thanked Ethan's parents for welcoming her into their family. She thanked her bridesmaids. She thanked the wedding planner. She thanked the musicians and photographers. Then she lowered the microphone. Not once did she thank the father who had quietly spent 15 years saving for the day she had just celebrated. I reached for my water glass, hoping no one would notice the slight tremble in my hand. Across the ballroom, however, one guest had noticed everything. A distinguished man in a charcoal suit slowly set down his fork. His eyes never left me. Then, without saying a word, he quietly stood from his chair. The applause after Emily's speech faded into an uneasy silence. Guests exchanged uncertain glances before quietly returning to their conversations, though the atmosphere had changed. The laughter that had filled the ballroom only moments earlier was gone, replaced by whispers and puzzled expressions. I lowered my eyes to my plate. Part of me wanted to believe I had misunderstood everything. Maybe Emily hadn't realized how her words sounded. Maybe I was simply being too sensitive. Before I could gather my thoughts, I noticed movement from across the room. The distinguished gentleman in the charcoal suit was walking toward the dance floor. He moved with quiet confidence, the kind that comes from decades of leading people rather than impressing them. He stopped beside the wedding coordinator. "Would it be all right if I shared a brief toast?" he asked politely. She looked surprised but smiled. "Of course." She handed him the microphone. The room gradually settled once again. "Good evening, everyone," the gentleman began. "My name is Jonathan Reeves." He smiled toward Ethan. "I've had the privilege of working with Ethan for several years." Ethan nodded respectfully. "He's one of the brightest young professionals I've ever mentored, and I couldn't be happier to celebrate this special day with him." Warm applause followed. Jonathan waited until the room became quiet again. "But," he continued gently, "I'm actually standing here because of someone else." Curious murmurs spread through the ballroom. He slowly turned toward my table. "Earlier tonight, I was introduced to Emily's father, Michael Bennett." Every head turned toward me. I knew I'd heard that name before. He smiled thoughtfully. "It bothered me all through dinner because I couldn't remember where." He paused. Then, during Emily's speech, it suddenly came back to me. I frowned slightly. I had never met this man before. At least, I didn't think I had. Jonathan walked a few slow steps across the dance floor. "About 14 years ago, my company evaluated a logistics scheduling system created by an independent developer. Several guests wearing business suits immediately looked interested. It wasn't designed by a major technology firm. It wasn't funded by venture capital. There was no flashy advertising campaign." He smiled. "It was built quietly by one man working nights after finishing full-time shifts." The room grew noticeably quieter. Our engineers studied the software for months. They expected to improve it. He chuckled softly. "They couldn't." A few executives near the front smiled knowingly. Jonathan continued. "The program solved transportation delays in ways that larger companies had overlooked for years. It eventually became part of several regional distribution networks." His eyes settled on me again. "And I never forgot the name of the person who created it." A strange feeling settled in my chest. Only Susan knew the full story. I had never discussed that project with Emily. In fact, I wasn't even sure she knew it had existed. Jonathan smiled warmly. "Ladies and gentlemen, the engineer behind that system is sitting right over there." He extended his hand toward my table. Every guest turned to look at me. Emily stared in complete disbelief. Ethan blinked several times before looking back at me. Even Susan looked surprised that someone outside our family remembered. Jonathan continued. "Michael Bennett spent years solving problems that companies with far greater resources couldn't solve. He never sought recognition. He never asked for interviews. He quietly accepted the purchase offer and returned to the job he genuinely enjoyed." The whispers around the ballroom grew louder. Jonathan raised one hand. "What impressed me most wasn't his talent. It was his character. He never introduced himself as an inventor. He never bragged about what he'd accomplished. In fact, until tonight, I don't believe most people in this room had any idea." The ballroom became completely silent. Then Jonathan looked directly at Emily. "The man you described as ordinary." He paused. "Helped transform an industry without ever needing applause." Emily's smile disappeared instantly. For the first time all evening, she looked as though she had no idea who her own father really was. And the evening was only beginning to reveal its biggest lesson. For several long seconds, the ballroom remained completely silent. The cheerful atmosphere that had filled the room only minutes earlier had disappeared. Guests who had been laughing over dessert now sat motionless, their attention fixed on Jonathan Reeves. He stood calmly in the center of the dance floor, never raising his voice. "I've spent more than 30 years working with business leaders," he continued. "I've met people who introduced themselves by listing their achievements before they even said hello. I've watched executives spend millions trying to convince the world they were successful." A faint smile crossed his face. "And then I've met people like Michael Bennett." He looked toward me. "The kind of people whose work speaks long after they leave the room." No one interrupted. Even the band members quietly lowered their instruments. Jonathan slowly walked a few steps closer to my table. "When our company first evaluated Michael's software, we assumed it had been built by an entire development team." A few guests leaned forward. "Our analysts spent weeks trying to understand how one person had designed such an efficient system." He laughed softly. "When we finally met the creator, we expected someone eager to tell us how brilliant he was. Instead, he smiled at me." "You know what Michael asked before signing the paperwork?" Several people shook their heads. "He wanted to know whether the warehouse employees using the system would need additional training." The room grew even quieter. He wasn't worried about headlines. He wasn't worried about awards. He was worried about the people who would actually use what he created. Jonathan paused for a moment. That told me everything I needed to know about the man. He turned slowly toward the guests. "Success isn't always the person driving the newest luxury car. It isn't always the loudest voice in the room. And it certainly isn't measured by expensive suits or impressive job titles." He looked around the ballroom before continuing. "Sometimes success looks like a father who quietly spends 15 years saving so his daughter can have the wedding she's always dreamed about." Several guests lowered their eyes. Others glanced toward the elegant decorations surrounding them. Jonathan gestured toward the ballroom. "This beautiful venue. The flowers. The musicians. The incredible meal we all enjoyed tonight." He smiled gently. "None of this happened by accident. It happened because one man consistently placed his daughter's happiness ahead of his own comfort." I felt every eye in the room shift toward me again. Honestly, I wish they wouldn't. I had never wanted attention. I had only wanted Emily to have the day she'd imagined since she was a little girl. Jonathan placed the microphone against his chest for a moment. "I don't know everything about this family, and I have no intention of embarrassing anyone." His voice remained kind. "But I couldn't sit here after hearing a man reduced to a collection of jokes when I know the kind of integrity he possesses." Then he looked directly at Emily. "The world has plenty of wealthy people. It has far fewer honorable ones." The sentence settled over the ballroom like a heavy curtain. Emily stared at the floor. The confident smile she'd worn during her speech was gone. Her hands trembled slightly as she gripped the stem of her champagne glass. Ethan quietly reached for her hand beneath the table. She barely noticed. Jonathan stepped off the dance floor and walked toward me. When he reached my chair, he extended his hand. "Mr. Bennett, it's an honor to finally meet you." I stood and shook his hand. His grip was warm and sincere. "Thank you," I said quietly. He smiled. "No, thank you for reminding all of us that character is still worth more than appearances." Before returning to his seat, Jonathan turned back toward the guests. "I believe this evening deserves one final toast." He raised his glass. "To the parents whose sacrifices are often invisible. Until one day everyone finally sees them." One by one, guests stood from their chairs. Then another table rose. And another. Within moments, nearly every person in the ballroom was standing. The applause wasn't loud or dramatic. It was steady, respectful, heartfelt. I looked toward the head table. Emily's face was wet with tears. For the first time that evening. She wasn't crying because she felt embarrassed. She was crying because she had finally realized that the man she'd spent years seeing as ordinary had quietly been the greatest example of extraordinary she'd ever known. The applause slowly faded. Guests returned to their seats, but the ballroom never regained the light-hearted atmosphere it had enjoyed earlier that evening. Conversations were quieter now. People spoke in hushed voices, stealing glances toward my table before quickly looking away. I wished none of it had happened. Not because Jonathan had said anything untrue, but because this was supposed to be Emily and Ethan's happiest day. Instead, everyone would remember the silence that followed her speech. Jonathan gave me one final nod before returning to his seat. As he walked away, he didn't look pleased with himself. He looked like a man who simply couldn't ignore the truth any longer. Susan gently reached for my hand beneath the table. "You okay?" she asked softly. I managed a small smile. "I will be." She studied my face for a moment. "You don't have to pretend with me." "I know." She squeezed my hand once before letting go. That simple gesture reminded me why we'd made it through 24 years of marriage. She never tried to fix my pain. She simply stayed beside me while I carried it. A few minutes later, Ethan quietly stood from the head table. Instead of heading toward the dance floor or speaking with guests, he walked directly to me. He stopped beside my chair. "Mr. Bennett." I looked up. His expression was filled with regret. "I'm sorry." I frowned. "You didn't do anything." I should have recognized where Emily's speech was going. He looked down for a moment. We practiced our speeches separately. I never heard hers. If I had. He shook his head. I would have asked her to change it. I believed him. Every word. I placed a hand on his shoulder. "You're a good man, Ethan. I don't feel like one tonight. This isn't your burden to carry." He looked toward Emily, who sat quietly at the head table, unable to meet anyone's eyes. "I love her. I know. I'll help her become better." I smiled sadly. "That's all any husband can promise." He nodded before quietly walking back. Watching him leave, I realized something important. Emily had chosen the right man. The mistake she made tonight wasn't because of him. It came from lessons she'd somehow taught herself over time. Nearly 15 minutes passed before Emily finally gathered the courage to move. She slowly walked across the ballroom. No one interrupted her. No one pretended not to notice. She stopped beside my chair, twisting her wedding ring nervously. "Dad." Her voice barely rose above a whisper. I looked up calmly. "Hi, sweetheart." The kindness in my voice made fresh tears roll down her cheeks. "I don't deserve you calling me that." I didn't answer. She took a shaky breath. "I've been standing over there trying to understand how I became the person who gave that speech." Silence. I honestly thought it was funny. Another pause. I thought everyone would laugh with us. I nodded slowly. They did. She closed her eyes. "That's what hurts the most." Emily wiped away her tears. When Mr. Reeves started talking, she swallowed hard. I realized I knew almost nothing about my own father. She looked directly into my eyes. "I never knew about the software. I never knew companies use something you built. I never knew you turned down a bigger career." I smiled faintly. Because none of those things were the most important part of my life. She frowned. Why didn't you ever tell me? Because I didn't need you to admire me. I paused. I only hoped you'd respect me. Those words hit her harder than anything Jonathan had said. She covered her mouth as another sob escaped. I thought being successful meant having more. Bigger homes. Better cars. More impressive friends. She shook her head slowly. I never realized I was overlooking the person who taught me what real success actually looks like. She took a hesitant step closer. I'm so sorry, Dad. I know. I embarrassed you. You did. I hurt you. You did. I can't take it back. No. Her shoulders slumped. For several seconds, neither of us spoke. Finally, she whispered the question she'd been afraid to ask. Can you ever forgive me? I looked at my daughter for a long time. The little girl who used to race into my arms after school. The teenager whose bicycle I repaired more times than I could count. The young woman whose dream wedding surrounded us at that very moment. I loved her with all my heart. That had never changed. But love didn't erase pain. I took a slow breath before answering. Emily, I'll never stop being your father. She nodded through tears. But forgiveness. I looked gently into her eyes. Isn't rebuilt in one conversation. It takes time. It takes honesty. And it takes choices. She lowered her head, understanding exactly what I meant. For the first time that night, she wasn't asking for an easy answer. She was finally ready to face a difficult one. Emily stood in front of me, tears streaming down her face. The ballroom had grown quiet again. Guests weren't pretending not to watch anymore. They weren't gossiping either. They simply understood that what was happening between a father and his daughter mattered far more than another dance or another toast. For a long moment, neither of us spoke. Then I slowly stood. Emily looked up, hope and fear fighting for space in her eyes. So, she whispered, does this mean you don't want me in your life anymore? The question caught me off guard. I shook my head immediately. No. Then, does it mean you hate me? A sad smile crossed my face. I could never hate you. She began crying even harder. I've given you every reason to. No, I replied gently. You've given me every reason to be hurt. That's different. She wiped at her tears, trying to steady her breathing. I spent so many years chasing the wrong things. I stayed silent. I thought success meant expensive neighborhoods, luxury vacations, and impressive job titles. She looked around the elegant ballroom. I was so focused on appearances that I stopped noticing the person who quietly made all of this possible. She swallowed hard. And the worst part is that I made fun of the very qualities that made you the man you are. I rested a hand lightly on her shoulder. When you were little, I said softly, do you remember building birdhouses with me in the garage? She nodded through her tears. You'd always rush to finish. A faint smile appeared on her face. And mine always looked crooked. I laughed. They did. But every time one fell apart, we built another. She looked at me carefully. What are you trying to tell me? I smiled gently. Relationships aren't much different. They can break. They can be damaged. But if both people are willing to do the work, it can be rebuilt. She took a slow breath. So there's still hope. There is. But hope isn't the same as trust. She nodded without arguing. I understand. No, I said kindly. I think tonight is the first time you truly do. Emily reached into the small bridal purse hanging from her wrist. She carefully removed an envelope. I was going to wait until after the honeymoon, She handed it to me. Inside was a handwritten letter. I started writing it last week. I unfolded it. The first page thanked Susan and me for every sacrifice we'd made throughout her childhood. The second page described memories I'd forgotten myself, late-night homework sessions, camping trips, broken bicycles, bedtime stories, and Sunday breakfasts before church. The final paragraph caught my attention. Dad, if I ever become half the parent you've been, I'll consider my life a success. I looked back at Emily. When did you write this? She lowered her eyes. Before the wedding. Then why didn't you say any of it tonight? Fresh tears filled her eyes. Because somewhere between writing that letter and standing in front of everyone, I worried that sounding sentimental would seem old-fashioned. She shook her head. So I tried to be funny instead. A painful silence followed. One choice. One speech. One careless decision. Sometimes that was all it took to wound someone you love. Just then, Ethan quietly joined us. He looked at Emily before turning to me. Mr. Bennett, I can't change tonight. But I promise you something. I waited. Our family won't measure success the way the world does. He reached for Emily's hand. We'll measure it by how we treat each other. I smiled. Hold on to that promise. It's worth more than any paycheck you'll ever earn. He nodded. I will. Later that evening, Susan and I stepped outside beneath a sky filled with stars. The cool breeze carried faint music from inside the ballroom. She slipped her arm through mine. Do you think she'll change? I looked back toward the glowing windows of the reception hall. I think tonight gave her a choice. And now it's up to her. Susan smiled softly. You've always believed people deserve another chance. I do. But second chances only matter when someone chooses to become different. As we walked toward my old pickup truck, I glanced back one last time. Emily and Ethan stood together near the entrance. She wasn't laughing anymore. She wasn't trying to impress anyone. She was simply watching us leave, with gratitude replacing pride. Maybe forgiveness would come in a few months. Maybe it would take years. Real healing rarely follows a schedule. But one thing was certain. That night wasn't remembered because of an expensive venue, or beautiful flowers, or crystal chandeliers. It was remembered because a room full of strangers learned something many people spend their entire lives chasing. True wealth isn't found in bank accounts. It isn't parked in luxury driveways. And it isn't measured by applause. It's found in quiet sacrifices, promises kept, and the people who love you even after you've given them every reason to walk away. As I started my old pickup, I smiled to myself. Some people spend their lives trying to look successful. I had spent mine trying to be useful. In the end, I realized I'd chosen the better path.